Blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits.
Well, hey everybody, this is Matt, and I'm coming to you from here in Taiwan. And this morning I was reading Psalm 9, and there were just some things that stuck out to me and that I thought would be of encouragement to you. So I thought we could just spend a couple minutes looking at Psalm 9. So Psalm 9 is a Psalm of David, and seems to kind of coincide with the time of 2 Samuel, when David had become the king of Israel. And so this is what Psalm 9 says. It says, I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart. I will tell of all thy wonders. I will be glad and exult in thee. I will sing praise to thy name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before thee. For thou hast maintained my just cause. Thou dost sit on the throne, judging righteously. Thou hast rebuked the nations. Thou hast destroyed the wicked. Thou hast blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy is come to an end in perpetual ruins, and thou hast uprooted the cities. The very memory of them has perished. But the Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment, and he will judge the world in righteousness. He will execute judgment for the peoples with equity. The Lord will also be a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know thy name will put their trust in thee. For thou, O Lord, hast not forsaken those who seek thee. Sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare among the people his deeds. For he who requires blood remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Be gracious to me, O Lord. Behold my affliction from those who hate me. Thou who dost lift me up from the gates of death. That I may tell of all thy praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in thy salvation. The nations have sunk down in the pit which they have made. In the net which they hid, their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment in the work of his own hands. The wicked is snared. And then it says, Higayon, Selah. The wicked will return to Sheol, even all the nations who forget God. For the needy will not always be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted perish forever. Arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged before thee. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. So just like reflecting on this passage, the first thing that occurred to me is just, the way that David regards God as a king. God is the King of all kings. He is the Lord of all lords. And I was just thinking about how for us in this world, that we live in now, the idea of being under a king doesn't really mean as much to us as it meant in David's time. A king was the ultimate authority. A king had the power to give life or death, essentially. The king had a kingdom, and he had people in his kingdom, people who were probably, the poor or, people who were servants. He also had, soldiers. He also had his household, and he had charge of all of these people in his kingdom. And so I think, for David, as he writes this, David himself is now a king and probably thinking about what it means to be a king. And he's facing enemies that surround him, other nations that want to conquer Israel and conquer him. And so, as he's thinking about maybe himself as king, he's also looking at God and considering God as a king. And, he says a lot of really interesting things in this passage. But the thing that really stuck out to me is verse 10. Verse 10 says, those who know thy name will put their trust in thee. And that really stuck with me today, because I think, those of us who know God, then that means that we know what God is like. We know things about what God is like. And David mentions all kinds of things about what God is like in this passage. And those are all things that I think are just, really awesome things that he pulls out here. But I like that idea of, people who know God put their trust in God. And I don't know where you are today in your relationship to God. If you know Him, if you believe Him, if you're just beginning to seek Him, maybe if you had a time when you were strong in faith at one time in your life, and maybe now you've kind of fallen away. But if you know God, if you really know what God is like, then you know that God is trustworthy. You know that God is righteous. You know that God is eternal. And that's how David talks about God here. David talks about God because he talks about God from a position of how he knows God, how God has revealed himself. So these are just things that he mentions. He knows that God is righteous, that God is eternal, that God is sovereign, right? He's the king on the throne. All of the other nations, all of the peoples are in his hands. He knows that God does not forsake those who seek him. People who are trying to find God, who are looking for God, will find him. That's promised to us time and time again in the Bible. God doesn't abandon people who are looking for him. He does not ignore people who are trying to find God. He pulls them to himself. It also talks about that enemies of God and enemies of God's people stumble and perish. They can't stand against God. God is the great power that, we live in a world that is, obviously filled with sin, and Satan is real, and he has his forces, and they are at work in this world. But ultimately, those forces, those enemies of God, will not prevail. God will utterly and completely defeat them. They will stumble and perish. Now, maybe we don't see that happen right now today in every way, but ultimately, that is their destiny, is that they're going to be totally defeated. It also says that God abides. And I like, thinking about the term abide also suggests that this is, that God is constantly living and constantly in action and constantly at work in the world. He is a living God. It says God will rebuke, which means to admonish or to scold. He will rebuke the wicked. He will destroy the wicked. And will destroy the enemies of God. It says that God does wonders, that God is worthy of praise, that God is worthy of our thanks, worthy of thanksgiving. It says that cities and kingdoms and nations are all in his hand, right? That's God's sovereignty. It says in this psalm that he will judge the world in righteousness, that he will not forget the needy or the poor or the people who, there's like this idea, and I think, again, this goes back to that idea of the kingship. The king is responsible for all of the people in his kingdom. And God, as our king, he doesn't forget about the poor or the afflicted or the oppressed. He remembers those people, and he will provide, and he will take care of those people. He will not forget them. That's what it says here in Psalm 9. It says he fights for the oppressed. It says that he is to be trusted. We should trust him. It says all of his deeds are noteworthy. The things that God does are worth talking about. It's worth telling other people about. That's why I think, oftentimes when we want to share the gospel, one of the easiest ways to share the gospel is just to tell other people what God has done for you. Tell other people how you have experienced God, because the things that God has done are noteworthy. The way that God has changed and transformed my life from what my life was like before I knew him to now, that's worth noting. God has transformed my life. He's changed my life. It also says that he gives grace, right? He is the one that gives us grace. He is the one that gives us salvation. That's also here in this psalm. There's also another really interesting thing. It says he requires blood, right? It says he who requires blood remembers them. That again gets to the idea that sin has a consequence, right? That sin has to be paid for, and sin is paid for with blood. And I mean, ultimately for us in Christ, that all of our sin was paid for by the blood of Christ on the cross. It says he's the one who lifts us up. Right? He lifts us up from death. You have the idea of eternal life there, but you also have the idea that death and life are in God's hands. Again, that speaks to his sovereignty. It says he gives salvation. He saves. He is a saving God. He makes himself known, right? The Lord has made himself known, verse 16. So we also have the idea here that, that God is at work in the world. He's intervening in the world. He's not going to allow the nations and the enemies of God to continue to interact forever. He is going to intervene. He does intervene in human affairs. Ultimately, he intervened in human affairs by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to this earth to be here with us. Jesus came from heaven to earth. That is God supernaturally intervening in human affairs, right? The other thing, one of the last things it says is that the nations and the wicked who forget God, who ignore God, they face judgment. They face, the way it's termed in the psalm is they face Sheol, right? Which is that place of perdition, of hell, right? They face destruction, right? A present destruction here on this earth when their time comes to an end, but also an eternal destruction in hell. And finally, the very last thing it says, we should fear him because he is God. He is sovereign. He is all powerful. He is, again, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the highest of all. But finally, it says that the nations need to know that we are just men, right? He is God, and we are just men. So I love the things that David talks about and really kind of reveals about how he has experienced God in Psalm 9. And these are things that I think for those of us who know God, we can look at this list of things and we can say, yes, these are all things that we know to be true of God. This is who God is. This is what God is like. We're living in uncertain times. We're living in times where what is true and what is fake is constantly debated. And, people oftentimes, we feel I feel confused sometimes about, what am I supposed to believe about what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing? But there is one thing, there is a rock and a foundation that we can stand on that is eternal, that is unchanging, that has been, from the beginning to the end. And that foundation is the Lord, is God. God is the one thing that remains trustworthy through all of the other stuff that happens in human history. As even though the waves pour over us and the tides change and the times change, and yet God is, and God continues to be. He is the one who was and who is to come, and that is the one thing that we can hold on to. He is the rock of salvation that we can put our faith in and that we can trust in the midst of the uncertainty and in the midst of confusion and in the midst of the just ever-changing nature of our times. We can put our faith and our trust in God like David did. We can say that we trust him, that he is our God, and that we can give thanks to the Lord with all of our heart, and we can tell of his wonders. So I pray for you that you can, like David, sing praises to the name of the Most High. So may the Lord bless you guys and be with you today wherever you are. I pray you'll cling to him and trust in him, and I pray he'll reveal himself to you, because if you seek him, you will find him.